Knowledge Products presents The Giants of Philosophy, narrated by Charlton Heston. This is tape number 1 on St. Thomas Aquinas.
Of all the words Thomas of Aquinas wrote, none inscribed the signature of his own life better than these.
Of all the pursuits open to the human person, the search for wisdom is more perfect, more sublime, more profitable, and more full of joy.
The most famous work by Thomas of Aquinas bears the Latin title Summa Theologia. It is an all-embracing synthesis of theology. He was a theologian by profession. This work needs to be understood in terms of his own aims and within his own time and place. Yet a rich vein of philosophy runs through it that reaches well beyond Thomas's own time. Thomas Aquinas had a fine reputation as a philosopher. We have evidence of this in an official letter in 1274 from the professors of philosophy in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Paris. Its affectionate tone is surprising when we realize that there was a chronic tension then between many philosophers and theologians. Thomas also belonged to an upstart religious order that was not quite welcome at the university. Nevertheless, when the philosophers received news of Thomas's death, they sent a letter to the Dominicans in Naples praising his philosophical insight. They also asked for the privilege of entombing his body in Paris. The Paris philosophers claimed with excusable, if not quite accurate, pride that Paris had nourished Thomas in his early intellectual development.
Paris first educated, nourished, and cherished him, and later received ineffable nourishment and education from him.
In a more practical vein, the professors requested some manuscripts, which Thomas had promised to send them. These were philosophical and scientific works by pagan Greek authors on cosmology, engineering, and logic. Thomas had been interpreting these manuscripts during the last year of his life. He had no direct disciple of note for his most innovative philosophical doctrines, but his own Summa, written in the 13th century, is held by many to be the greatest intellectual achievement of the entire medieval and scholastic period, which lasted from 500 A.D. to 1500 A.D., 1,000 years. That's better than being named Man of the Year, right? For the most part, Thomas escaped the derision hurled at the Middle Ages by scholars who worked during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Modern scholars noted how well his work was liked.
Even non-Catholic philosophers and theologians have praised his doctrine. According to Erasmus, there was no theologian equal in industry, or more balanced in genius, or more solid in learning, and Leibniz admired the solidity of his doctrine.
Thomas has earned respect even from those who disagree with him for his reasonable arguments, his balanced judgment, and his sweeping vision. But this wasn't always, or everywhere, true. Shortly after Thomas's death, the Bishop of Paris issued a local condemnation that included several of his teachings. The Universal Catholic Church, on the other hand, was quick to secure his fame. He was canonized in 1323, less than 50 years after his death. In 1567, he was declared a doctor of the Church, which in modern terms means teacher of the Church. In 1879, Pope Leo XIII praised Thomas as the chief and master of all these doctors, for he'd gathered and added to the work of the ancient doctors of the Church.
The doctrines of those illustrious men are like the scattered members of a body. Thomas collected together and cemented, distributed in wonderful order, and so increased with important additions that he is rightly esteemed the special bulwark and glory of the Catholic faith. With his spirit at once humble and swift, his memory ready and tenacious, his life spotless throughout, a lover of truth for its own sake, richly endowed with human and divine science, like the sun, he heated the world with the ardor of his virtues and filled it with the splendor of his teaching.
Thomas's thought has been recognized as an achievement of permanent interest, not only to Catholics, but to all students of philosophy. Scholarship over the past century has produced modern critical editions of his works and translations in many languages. This has produced a better understanding of his thought in its historical setting. Thomas Aquinas was born about 1225 in the family castle at Roccaseca, near a southern Italian town named Aquino, along the road from Naples to Rome. Thomas was the youngest son of a local official who was in the service of the Emperor Frederick I of Sicily. At the age of 5, he was sent to the nearby Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino, where he received his first schooling. There he learned his letters and the elements of religion. There, too, the small boy was remembered by the monks for the question he asked with great seriousness: "What is God?" 9 years later, the monastery was plundered by soldiers of the Emperor Frederick II of Sicily. Thomas, at age 14, and with his first education behind him, spent some time at home. Then he took up new studies at the first state university in Europe, the Imperial University at Naples. There he studied philosophy, letters, and science, and there, too, he tasted the winds of change. At age 19, Thomas took it upon himself to join the Order of Preachers. This was a religious society recently founded by St. Dominic and known thereafter as the Dominicans. Its members were sworn to a life of poverty. They were to beg for their sustenance and avoid all ostentation. Dominic took as his own the words of his companion, Bishop Diego, and he counseled his followers in this way:
"Forget everything else, and labor more passionately at preaching. Go humbly, following the example of our loving Master Jesus, teaching and acting, traveling on foot without silver and gold, imitating the apostolic pattern in everything."
On their frequent travels, the Dominicans were forbidden even the small comfort of being carried on a horse, donkey, or cart. Thomas's family was appalled. They'd had in mind a higher office in the church, such as the Abbacy of Monte Cassino. His brothers went so far as to kidnap him, but before the year was out, Thomas had won his release and made his way to Paris for further studies. He spent 3 years in Paris, from age 20 to 23. He spent the next 4 years in the Dominican House of Studies at Cologne. Here he was apprenticed to the most learned teacher of the century, the German Dominican Albert the Great. From 1252 until 1256, just after he'd turned 30, he was once again in Paris, busy with what we now call graduate studies. Upon receiving a doctorate in theology, Thomas was admitted to a university teaching chair in 1257 at the age of 32. He taught as professor of theology in Paris until 1259, when his order assigned him to duties in Rome and the surrounding region, including the papal court. From his mid-30s to his mid-40s, Thomas was busy in Italy. He taught, preached, wrote, administered, and counseled. Then, contrary to custom, he was called back to a second professorate in Paris, perhaps because the Dominicans wanted their best thinker present at the center of their very lively controversies. Thomas taught at Paris from 1269 to 1272, and then he was sent back to Naples to organize a Dominican house of studies. Now in his mid-40s, Thomas continued to teach at the university in Naples and to preach in the local dialect to large crowds of lay people. His activity and output was exceptional during the 4th decade of his life, but his health began to fail during the spring of 1273, then it fell rapidly in December of that year. He may have had a series of strokes. During this time, he also seems to have had a series of profound religious experiences. When Thomas was called to a general church council in France, he set out for it, as usual, on foot. But he fell ill along the way while visiting a niece. At Thomas's request, he was transported, this time on a donkey, to the nearby Cistercian monastery at Fossanova, where he died at age 49 on March 7th, 1274. Thomas walked through large parts of Italy, France, and Germany. He lived in the cities of Naples, Paris, Cologne, Paris again, Rome, and still again, Paris and Naples yet again. But most of his life was spent within his sparse study cell, the chapel, and the lecture hall. There are many stories that Thomas was usually absorbed in study and thought. One of them tells of a picnic outing a few miles north of Paris. Not unlike a tourist today, Thomas had gone with some students to see the Gothic wonders of the Abbey Church at Saint-Denis. It was a beautiful day. In the distance below, the city of Paris lay before their eyes like a shining jewel. The students began a playful discussion, each trying to outdo the other in imagining what they might give to own such a rich city. They wearied of the game among themselves, so they turned to their teacher.
Look, Master.
What a fine city Paris is!
Wouldn't you like to be lord of it?
But from the master came the laconic reply.
I would rather have Chrysostom on Matthew.
They knew what he meant. The lost commentary by St. John Chrysostom on St. Matthew's Gospel. Thomas had a very scholarly preference indeed. He lived a quiet life near the centers of thought during one of the most flourishing centuries of the era we now call medieval. Of course, along with everyone else, he didn't know he was living in the Middle Ages. That term's only about 200 years old. It represents a shift in our thinking about the past. The term Middle Ages leads us to look upon the 1,000-year period beginning in about 500 AD as a mere stretch of time standing between us and antiquity. But of course, no age is simply an interval between other times. Each era is filled with its own life. During the 12th and 13th centuries, Western Europe went through a rapid intellectual transformation that brought with it wide and deep cultural and social consequences. In the modest classrooms of the monastery, cathedral, and palace, scribes and teachers maintained a modicum of learning and preserved the basic documents of Western civilization. From these classrooms arose the great universities of Europe, including the Sorbonne in Paris, at which Thomas taught. Each university was a study of the universe, incorporated into a universe of studies. There were studies of theology, philosophy, arts and sciences, law, medicine, administration. Each university was a corporation of scholars, a community of teachers and students. Roman law was rediscovered and adapted. Arabic medicine was learned. Greek philosophy was translated. The works of Aristotle and his commentators began to flood the schools. 12th century scholars enthusiastically studied Aristotle's works on logic. 13th century scholars then became interested in the whole range of Aristotelian treatises, along with commentaries and works from Muslim and Jewish authors. Indeed, in less than a century, a dozen new branches of study were making their way into Western minds. A modern scholar sums up the situation as it affected Thomas.
Up to 1259, when St. Thomas came to Italy, his knowledge of Aristotle, vast and impressive as it was, nevertheless depended to a considerable extent on rather second-hand information and sources. At the court of the great and inspiring Pope Urban IV, 1261-64, he realized the necessity of introducing Greek patristic thought into theology. It might have been during those same years that he also conceived the plan of a vast investigation into the letter and the original teaching of Aristotle, in order exactly to define Aristotelianism and its place in Christian thought. Tradition credits Aquinas with the initiative in regard to new, more accurate translations, not only of the Aristotelian writings, but also of the Greek commentators.
As a Christian, Thomas confessed the traditional faith. As a theologian, he taught it. And as a philosopher, he sought with all his energy to increase his understanding by using the new philosophical resources. Professionally, Thomas was part of a committee that recommended a thorough training in philosophy for all Dominicans. Ancient philosophical writings had come into Latin indirectly from the original Greek, mostly from Arabic translations that had been made from earlier Syriac translations. Inevitably, this indirect process had led to distortion and loss of meaning, so Thomas took great care to secure the best translations from the Greek. A modern scholar sums up his concern.
Thomas knew practically no Greek, except for a few technical words and phrases. Therefore, Thomas had to depend on the available Latin translations. Nevertheless, he had an uncanny ability to grasp the sense intended by a Greek author. His grasp of the intention of an author far surpasses that of other schoolmen. In theology, Thomas was deeply concerned about understanding the precise meaning of the councils of the Church and of the Greek fathers. Therefore, he went out of his way to procure better and more accurate translations of their documents and writings. In philosophy, too, he was concerned about better translations of Aristotle.
Thomas lectured to his university students on the Bible, but he also painstakingly took his students through Aristotle's major works. He published commentaries on Aristotle's logical works on natural philosophy, psychology, metaphysics, ethics, and politics. He usually defended Aristotle, only occasionally disagreed with him, and sometimes quietly went beyond him. But above all, Thomas tried to make clear the great philosopher's meaning. He didn't want universal approval. Thomas and his own teacher, Albert the Great, raised some traditional eyebrows by the attention they gave to Aristotle. Indeed, a disgruntled traditionalist remarked that Thomas and Albert were so determined to turn Aristotle into a Christian that they'd succeeded only in turning themselves into heretics. In this formal yet lively academic milieu, Thomas Aquinas stood out. He was tall, with a robust figure and a dark complexion, but he was by nature and training a quiet, modest sort of man. We've seen that he accepted administrative duties when they were thrust upon him. He must have discharged them well. They were laid on him often enough. He maintained good relations with his superiors, and he respected church authorities. Indeed, there seem to have been plans to make Brother Thomas a bishop, maybe even a cardinal. But he made it quite plain to his faithful companion and secretary, Reginald, that he would be most useful as a teacher, and that he firmly intended to remain one. Yet at first he'd shrunk from teaching. He was even reluctant to accept his degree as Master of Theology, which is the equivalent to a modern doctorate. The secular masters at the University of Paris bitterly opposed admitting to the faculty begging friars of the Dominican and Franciscan orders. A modern biographer points up Thomas's predicament early in his adult life.
Thus, in the fall of 1252, Thomas went to the Priory of Saint-Jacques in Paris to prepare himself to begin teaching. These were troubled times in Paris. The amicable relations that existed earlier between the Dominicans and the secular masters of the university had turned to bitter hatred and strong opposition. It was into this milieu that Thomas was sent, too young in years and too reluctant in heart to engage in controversy. The anti-mendicant controversy was to overshadow all of Thomas's days in Paris.
The Dominican and Franciscan friars disturbed the settled order of things, and the professors feared their allegiance to religious superiors might dominate their responsibilities as members of the academic community. Indeed, only the Pope's personal intervention finally secured the degree for Thomas and for his famous Franciscan colleague, St. Bonaventure. Thomas thought he was too young for the degree. According to the regulations, he was, at 30, underage by 5 years. Nor did he think himself well enough prepared to shoulder the obligations of the office. Things went forward anyway. The night before his inaugural lecture, according to a creditable story, which can only have come from Thomas, he was plagued by doubts. He still had no theme for his first lecture. He fell into a troubled dream in which an old man asked him,
"Brother Thomas, why are you praying and weeping?"
To which Thomas answered in the dream,
"Because they are making me take the degree of master, and I do not think I am fully competent. What is more, I cannot think what theme to take for my inaugural lecture."
The reply was,
"Do not fear. God will help you to bear the burden of being a master. And as for the lecture, take this text from the Psalms. Only God waters the hills, and He alone makes the earth fruitful."
Thomas had an intimate sense of the presence of God, and this is central to understanding not only Thomas the future saint, but also Thomas the teacher and thinker. As a theologian, he believed that arguments based on the authority of the Scriptures are the most certain. Arguments that use the texts of church fathers he considers to be at least probable. But as a philosopher, Thomas is fully aware that other arguments should be accepted only through the force of their reason. He believes that an appeal to merely human authority is the weakest of arguments. To understand fully the arguments Thomas presents in the Summa, we must remember that his principal task is to teach sacred doctrine, the way all things stand in relation to God. To do that, he believes that accurate interpretation of Scripture is vital. For Thomas, each passage of the Scripture has several levels of meaning. The literal or historical meaning of the text is primary, but he's not a fundamentalist in the current sense of that word. For him, the literal sense is whatever meaning the divine author intends to convey. The literal meaning provides the basis for further spiritual meanings, which may be allegorical, moral, or mystical. He's convinced that we must study the Bible with whatever aids we can use, beginning with personal dedication, prayer, meditation, and an upright life. But he also insists that a learned appreciation of God's Word calls for an up-to-date education in philosophy, literature, and the sciences. So Thomas draws upon insights from the Church Fathers, from pagan authors, and from the learning of his day to increase the understanding of his students and himself. When Thomas joined the Dominican order, he accepted its mandate. Hand on the fruits of your contemplation to others. Since teaching was Thomas's chosen profession and his primary purpose in writing the Summa, it seems appropriate to hear what he has to say about teaching. In the jargon of the day, Thomas asks whether teaching is primarily theoretical contemplation or practical action. For him, contemplation is an activity through which we gain true knowledge about God and his creation. The contemplative life, then, finds its completion and delight in discovering truth. The active life, on the other hand, finds its meaning in helping one's neighbor. We might put the question differently and ask, what makes a teacher great? Is it the knowledge he's gained from study and research, or is it the ability to communicate that knowledge to students? Of course, before we communicate knowledge, we must possess it. Without total understanding, what is there to teach? Insight can be understood as a light bursting inside the inner recesses of our minds. Yes, like the light bulb in the comic strips. If this is true, then it follows that a good teacher must live a sort of secret inner life, where ideas emerge, points of light arise. One day, Thomas was busy at work in the cell that was his place of study and prayer. He was called out of his cell to meet a cardinal who'd come to consult with him. Thomas drifted out of the conversation back into that secret inner place. Then suddenly he came back to himself. He addressed his guest somewhat shamefacedly.
My lord, please excuse me. I thought I was still in my cell. A beautiful idea has just occurred to me for the work on which I am engaged at present. It was a really wonderful idea, and it gave me such pleasure.
Much of Thomas's life was lived in that secret place. The biography of his external life seems spare. Yet great teaching, as distinct from merely good teaching, happens when the student feels a flame from within the teacher, igniting a flame in his own heart and life. This is where we find Thomas's real contribution to history. Still, he tells us that teaching is more active than contemplative, more practical than theoretical, directed more outwards than inwards. On the one hand, teaching has a share in the contemplative life because its subject matter appeals to the understanding. But on the other hand, teaching a student requires an active life of instruction. Thomas finds his own answer a bit too simple, so he asks further about the balance between contemplation and action.
The insight of the teacher is a source of teaching. But teaching consists more in the communication of the things seen than in seeing them. And so, even the insight of the teacher belongs more to action than to contemplation.
Even in his inner secret life of thought, Thomas is concerned not only to see the truth of the matter, but also to help others see the truth. That's why he wrote the Summa. He must have thought often of the teacher's perennial question, how can I get this point across? His inner life was enlivened, then, by the effort to see and to communicate, and by the prayer and study that supported that endeavor. In the more than 90 works that make up Thomas's corpus, his written style varies from plain to technical, depending on who's to hear it or read it. This attention to his audience must have been clear in his teaching. His contemporaries, writing immediately after his death and even during his life, remark again and again on his lecture style. The biographer Bernard Guy, writing shortly after his death, comments,
Once Thomas was possessed of the degree and started on his course of lecturing, God graced his teaching so that it began to make a wonderful impression upon the students. For it seemed so novel, new arrangements of the subject matter, new methods of proof, new arguments adduced from conclusions. In short, no one who heard him could doubt that his mind was full of a new light from God.
Like a master builder, Thomas uses old and new materials to shape an intricate, comprehensive, intellectual edifice, not unlike the great cathedrals that were springing up in every large town. Thomas combines pagan, Jewish, and Muslim learning, and especially Aristotle's work, with the traditions of the Greek and Latin church fathers, like St. Augustine and certain Neoplatonists. Like the cathedrals, Thomas's structure and light were new. The result is a fresh vision integrated by Scripture, a vision which seeks the improved understanding, and that's the goal of all teaching. He discusses what it means to teach.
If we consider the goal towards which teaching is directed, teaching seems to belong to the active life, because its ultimate subject, the student, in whom it reaches the goal that inspires it, is a subject immersed in the active life. And so it is clear that although teaching is, in some sense, a function of the contemplative life, it is more properly a work of the active than of the contemplative life.
About 15 of Thomas's letters survive out of what must have been many more. He was often consulted by churchmen and academics on theological, philosophical, and scientific matters, but he was also asked to give advice on other topics to many people. For example, his Dominican superior consulted him about letters of credit. Thomas confessed his limited knowledge of the subject and urged his superior to seek better advice. Writing to the Duchess of Brabant, Thomas ended his letter by cautioning her to form her own opinions about regulations for Christian officials and also for Jews.
At this time it has occurred to me, illustrious and pious lady, that these things should be written in reply to your questions. In these matters, I do not so force my own opinion upon you, that I do not urge you to hold that of a more learned person.
Several laymen consulted him about the dubious practices of divination and astrology, and he took time off during his summer vacation to answer them, with the same meticulous care he gave to these topics in the Summa. Yet another letter illustrates the way in which he took the teaching life to include helping your neighbor. It's a reply to a hurried request that Thomas answer approximately 36 questions in 4 days. The questions seem to have been proposed in no particular order and in rather obscure language. Thomas restates the questions more clearly and rearranges them in a logical order before answering them. He writes perhaps with a certain asperity.
Having read your letters, I found in them a great number of articles which your charity requested me to answer within 4 days. And, although I have been very busy, I have put aside for a time the things that I should do, and have decided to answer individually the questions which you proposed, so as not to be lacking to the request of your charity.
After dealing with the questions, Thomas continues.
These are the things, very dear brother, which I write more elaborately than you requested in response to the articles which you sent.
He then adds a remark that stresses the importance of objections and counterpositions. He emphasizes that objections help limit the perspective of the question and define its context.
It is not possible to reply absolutely to these opinions, for they can be taken in different senses, especially since you have not mentioned what may be objected against these articles. In such a case, a more absolute and certain reply could have been given. May your charity endure, and for this work, please remember me in your prayers.
In all of these replies, Thomas's advice is backed up by his reasons, so the letters are a kind of teaching outside the lecture hall. A number of Thomas's works are divided in the familiar format of books and chapters, but when he began to compose the Summa in 1265, he chose a peculiarly medieval form that had evolved during the past century from university debates. There already were published summas of theology, law, logic, grammar, other subjects. The Summa form was popular because it was energized with dialogue and controversy. Making objections and answering them is vital. There are 10,000 objections and replies in Thomas's Summa. The dialogue defines the question, voices the most important positions, puts the question itself into context, and suffuses the whole with a flow of argument. His Summa was destined to become the best known and most widely read of all the works in this style. His success occurred in part because he streamlined the genre. Thomas stresses simplicity and order in the prologue to the work.
Since the teacher of Catholic truth ought not only to instruct advanced scholars, but also to teach beginners, what we propose to do in this work is to treat those items that are pertinent to the Christian religion in a manner that is adapted to the teaching of beginners.
Thomas doesn't expect the scriptures to follow a logical order, but a theological exposition should. So he criticizes existing textbooks or summaries for being poorly organized.
As a matter of fact, we have thought that new students of this doctrine are held back by several features of the writings produced by different authors, partly by the multiplication of useless questions, articles, and arguments, partly, too, because the things that such students must know are not treated according to the order of learning, but according to the order that the development of textbooks has required, or according to whatever order the occurrence of a disputation has dictated, and partly because frequent repetition of the same points has generated both boredom and confusion in the minds of their audience.
And with that, Thomas announces his own purpose.
So, in the effort to avoid these and other impediments, we shall try, with trust in divine assistance, to go through the pertinent points in sacred doctrine briefly and clearly, to the extent that the subject matter permits.
Thomas divides the Summa itself into three main parts and subdivides the middle part into two halves. The first of the three parts inquires into the one and triune God and examines the procession of creatures that flow from his creative act. The second part begins discussing why rational creatures move back towards God. This second part of the Summa has two halves. The first half considers union with God as the ultimate destiny of human beings. It considers the general nature of the acts which lead either to that goal or away from it. The second half of the second part takes up the specific virtues that help us move towards God, including the particular opportunities and difficulties that occur in the various careers or vocations of life. In the third of the three parts of Summa Theologiae, Thomas takes up the mystery of Christ as Savior and discusses the sacraments as the ways to union with God. This third part is unfinished, however. Thomas treated only the sacraments of baptism, confirmation, and penance before abandoning the work. A supplement completes the discussion of the sacraments, but it was written by another hand. Each of the three parts of the Summa Theologiae is further divided into sections, or treatises. The sections are divided into topics, or major questions. These major questions are divided into individual questions, or articles. All in all, there are 512 major questions, which include a total of over 2,600 articles. The structure or layout of the individual questions, or articles, takes its origin from classroom teaching and public disputation. During Christmas and Easter, the more daring masters announced freewheeling debates. The general public was invited, not only to listen, but to put questions from the floor as well. Most masters held one or two of these public disputations during their careers. Some held none at all, maybe thinking themselves well out of the free-for-all. Thomas, on the other hand, seems to have enjoyed them. His printed works contain no less than 12 collections of debates. A modern biographer describes these public occasions.
Quod libet questions were a special kind of disputation that masters could hold, if they wished, during Advent and Lent. By definition, a quod libet was a public disputation about any subject whatever. For this kind of disputation, masters could not propose the subject to be discussed. This came from any student or master in the audience. The proposal of a question for discussion could come from anyone permitted in the room. Often such questions were an embarrassment to the master, who was bound to determine them in that session. One might say that only masters of some daring would expose themselves to any kind of question raised from the floor.
Interestingly, the Latin for this disputation, quodlibet, gives us our modern word quibble. In addition to these general debates, Thomas arranged for more tightly organized public disputations to take place within the university. We have 7 collections of these exchanges, which are published under the title Disputed Questions. A pertinent question was announced beforehand and always took a definite form, such as whether it is true or not that the human being has free choice. 1 or 2 doctoral students or young teachers would be assigned to present a series of arguments on both sides of the issue. The master would then make the response. He would state his own position with supporting arguments and then take up each of the arguments already given, resolving their difficulties in the light of his own determination. Each article or individual question in the Summa is a simplified disputation. It has 5 parts. First, it states the question in definite form. Second, instead of the usual dozen or more objections in the disputation, the Summa gives about 3 that go to the heart of the particular difficulty. Third, it then indicates the direction of the solution. This statement is usually, but not always, a brief citation, either from Scripture, the Church Fathers, or Aristotle, whom they called the philosopher. Fourth, the body of the article contains Thomas's own argument and conclusion. Fifth, and finally, the objections are resolved in the light of the principles set forth in the body of the article. Given Thomas's calling to be a theologian and his personal dedication to a religious life, it's not surprising that the focus of Thomas's thought, its source and its goal, is to see the face of God. But of course he knows that this goal and source can't be reached in this life. Moreover, he sees no conflict in being both theologian and philosopher, since the source of truth is one and the same. Only one thing's required of a Christian thinker if he's to be an honest philosopher, and that's to recognize 2 distinct kinds of knowledge and 2 distinct modes of thought. There can be a certain tension between philosophy and theology, between ordinary reason and faith. Some Christians saw this tension as one of constant conflict. The most famous comment about this was by the African theologian Tertullian in the 3rd century.
What, after all, has Athens to do with Jerusalem?
In other words, what has philosophical reasoning to do with religious faith? Tertullian remarked that he believed despite the philosophical problems of religious belief.
I believe because it is absurd.
Others saw the relation of philosophy and theology as a situation of harmonious tension. In the 2nd century, a theologian known as St. Justin Martyr had spoken of 2 rivers of knowledge, the one flowing from Jerusalem, the other from Athens. Thomas himself remarks that St. Augustine had adopted many teachings from the philosopher Plato. Augustine had tested these teachings only by the higher evaluation of faith.
Whenever Augustine, who was imbued with the doctrines of the Platonists, found in their teaching anything consistent with faith, he adopted it, and those things which he found contrary to faith, he amended.
This is a strategy that Thomas also practices in his bold interpretation of Aristotelian philosophy. He sees no conflict in principle between the results reached by reason and faith. Philosophy and science carefully use reason on its own terms. Sacred doctrine seeks the deeper religious mysteries revealed by faith. Thomas doesn't think it's necessary or even desirable to separate theology from philosophy, as long as we distinguish between their legitimate spheres. But this position was not shared by all Christians. In the 11th century, the Christian monk Peter Damian became suspicious of the unbridled enthusiasm for what then passed as philosophy, namely speculative grammar, logic, and dialectics. With characteristic pungency, he tells us,
The omnipotent God did not need grammar in order to save humanity by spreading the seeds of the new faith, and so he did not send eloquent philosophers, but simple fishermen instead.
Peter Damian further complains that the first grammarian, that is, the first philosopher, was the devil, who took the form of a snake to teach Adam to use the word God in the plural.
Look, brother, do you wish to learn grammar? Then learn to decline God in the plural.
Of course, the tension between divine revelation and human reason is not peculiar to Christianity. Jewish and Muslim thinkers also arrive at various ways of accommodating this tension, ranging from complete separation to harmonious coexistence. Indeed, Thomas owes much to Jewish thinkers, such as Rabbi Moses Maimonides, and to Muslim thinkers such as Avicenna and Averroes. While Thomas didn't completely agree with Maimonides, the following words of the rabbi can be taken as the emblem of Thomas's whole life.
We learn in the Bible that Moses prayed to God to grant him knowledge of his attributes, and he continued to pray for the knowledge of God's essence in the words, "Show me thy glory."
Nor is the tension peculiar to the Middle Ages. Among Christians, a certain wariness of ordinary reason was later voiced in different ways by Pascal, Jacobi, and Kierkegaard. This wariness has expressed itself in the 19th century in the debate between the Bible and science. And in our own century, Christians range all the way from fundamentalists, who often are suspicious of some modern scientific theories, to rationalists who subordinate the biblical texts to the latest historical critical theories. The problem of reason versus revelation also may apply to non-believers, secularists, or atheists. There's much in every life that lies outside of reason and philosophy. All of us must reflect upon a broad range of experiences, speculations, and possibilities to create a set of beliefs and understandings that can satisfy and sustain our lives. Thomas confidently asserts that a harmony of faith and reason respects the integrity of each domain. He believes that to develop the powers of reason is to celebrate the dignity with which humans are endowed. Reason mirrors the inherent intelligibility of the created universe. In another work on the Christian Trinity, Thomas says,
Christian theology issues from the light of faith, philosophy from the natural light of reason. Philosophical truths cannot be opposed to the truths of faith. They fall short indeed. Yet they also admit common analogies, and some, moreover, are foreshadowings. For nature is the preface to grace.
Thomas thinks that the Bible deals with mysteries to which the philosophical use of reason has no access. These mysteries include the Trinitarian Godhead, the Incarnation, and the Resurrection. But he also tells us that the Bible contains rational guidelines for a good life. Thomas finds in Scripture many truths that are in principle accessible to rational discovery, but these truths are arrived at only after many years. Only a few learned people have the ability, disposition, and leisure to search for them. So for those of us who can't spend a lifetime thinking only about truth, beauty, and goodness, Thomas believes God has deposited these truths of reason within the revelation recorded in Holy Scripture.
This is the end of Side 1. Please fast forward and turn over your cassette.
Despite his central concern with God, Thomas doesn't think that God's existence is self-evident. Thomas had great confidence in the capacities of human reason, yet he would not agree with St. Anselm or Descartes that God's existence can be proven directly from our concept of a most perfect being. Thomas does think, though, that our experience of the physical world holds enough traces of God's presence to provide the basis for a proof. This proof will lead us to the knowledge that God exists, and it can give us some hints about his nature. In approaching the question of God's existence, Thomas anticipates two objections that complicate any attempt to prove that there is a God. First of all, there's the problem that evil exists. The 2 world wars of the 20th century suggest that the problem of evil may loom larger today than it did in Thomas's time. But Thomas's readers knew plague and pillage, fire and famine all too well, as we still do today. Betrayal, brutality, rape, and murder are common to his time and ours. How then can any reasonable man suggest that there's a divine, benevolent being who creates and governs this world? The objector answers in words too calm for the bewilderment and anguish that lie beneath them.
It seems that there is no God, because if one of 2 contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. But the name God means that which is infinite goodness. If, therefore, God existed, there would be no evil discoverable. But there is evil in the world. Therefore, God does not exist.
That's the question. Either there is God and no evil, or evil and no God. How can a good, all-powerful God stand idle while the work of his hand is wrecked and his creatures suffer? Would not nothingness be better than so much misery, the pain of the world, pain we all know? The second question's different. It stands on the pride of human reason, on the idea that science is self-sufficient. Science sets out to provide a rational account of the world in terms of principles and laws based on human experience. The natural sciences explain the physical world, and the social sciences explain human nature. The existence of God is irrelevant. Nature and society suffice. There's no need to go beyond them to account for our experience. The objector complains,
It is superfluous to suppose that what can be accounted for by a few principles has been produced by many. But it seems that everything we see in the world can be accounted for by other principles, supposing God did not exist. For all natural things can be reduced to one principle, which is nature, and all voluntary things can be reduced to one principle, which is human reason or will. Therefore, there is no need to suppose God's existence.
the principle of economy applies here. In explaining things, we appeal to no more causes than are necessary. This tactic has been called Occam's razor. We must shave down our arguments to their most simple and direct components. Anyone today could say that science does a good enough job. Left alone, it'll do better still. The rationalist says there's no need to appeal to some mysterious source beyond the world to explain what happens in it. Don't reach for what lies beyond our grasp. Be content with what we can know. A bird in the hand, half a loaf. These are better than none. The first objection demands all or nothing. The second asks, if not all, why not at least something? Thomas answers from the Bible. I am who am. He understood that to be the name of God. He turns to the philosophers to answer the question, does God exist? Thomas constructs one overall proof, but he presents 5 versions of it. His result goes far beyond the pagan Greek philosophers. Thomas insists on beginning with concrete things rather than abstract ideas.
Human knowledge is derived from sensible objects.
So all 5 ways of proving God's existence begin with first-hand, sensible experience, but each way has a different starting point in experience. These ways are not original with Thomas. The first is drawn directly from Aristotle, the second from the Arab philosopher Avicenna, the third is from the Jewish thinker Moses Maimonides, the fourth ultimately from Plato by way of St. Augustine. And the fifth and most popular seems to have been drawn from a Greek church father, St. John Damascene, though it was widespread among both Christian and pagan authors. Thomas's 5 ways compose almost a miniature of his intellectual background. His arguments are not entirely new, but they're modified and deepened in very important ways. As we'll see in more detail, the first way to prove God's existence starts from the fact that things are in motion. The second way starts with the fact that one thing acts upon another. The third proof begins with the fact that none of the things in our experience, neither you nor I nor any other thing, exists by absolute necessity. It's quite conceivable that we might never have existed at all. The fourth proof begins with the fact that things differ in respect to various qualities, some being more or less good, some more or less meaningful, more or less beautiful. And in the fifth way, we observe that things usually act according to regular patterns which reflect some intelligence or order. Each way is meant to bear its own weight. As spokes of a wheel, all 5 converge on a common center. Yet the 5 together are meant to provide the mind with the basis for further knowledge of God. We should point out in passing that these famous 5 ways are not the same as the 3 later proofs of God that have been attacked by David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and other modern philosophers. These later proofs were to become current in 18th century textbooks, and they reflect the more modern rationalist and idealist presuppositions of the Enlightenment. Let's look in detail at the first of Thomas's 5 ways of proving God's existence. The first way is sometimes called the argument from motion. It's so important in philosophical history that we should spend some time developing it. Then we'll be able to see by example how Thomas would develop his other 4 ways. He begins,
The first and most manifest way is the argument from motion. For it is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion.
Thomas has begun with what he takes to be the easiest starting point. It's obvious, undeniable, that things move and change. You can wave your hand to prove that, or look at the setting sun. It's worth noting that for this first proof, we don't need to agree with the Greek philosopher Heraclitus that all things change. It's enough to find one single thing in motion and to ask what that means. But you have to do more than wave your hand to establish the existence of God. We have to determine the conditions where movement takes place. To do that, Thomas takes a not-so-small first step from observation to analysis. He takes up concepts he's learned from Aristotle.
Now, whatever is moved by another.
But this, of course, requires an explanation.
Nothing can be moved, except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is moved, whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is actual.
This follows from the understanding of movement that Thomas shares with Aristotle.
For motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality.
This argument will be a little plainer if we reshuffle the statements. The movement of anything is the passage from something potential to something actual. But that passage can't take place unless a movement is caused by something independent of the thing that moves. And so whenever we see something in motion, we can know it's been moved by something else. Your hand waves, but you make it wave. Thomas's analysis makes explicit a common fact of our experience, the distinction between being and becoming. For example, there's a difference between being a good musician and having the ability to become a good musician. Water can become hot only if it's first not hot, and yet is able to be hot. And of course, experience teaches us that different things have different capacities appropriate to them. It's natural to wonder why philosophers ponder such obvious facts. For Thomas, that's philosophy's job, to think about facts and situations in order to produce general conclusions about the origin, nature, and purpose of such facts. Philosophical conclusions challenge us to think deeply and critically about unfamiliar aspects of the familiar things about us. Thomas has learned from Aristotle that because movement is very smooth and fluid, it's the most difficult notion for the mind to attend to. The mind loves to pin things down, especially by naming, classifying, measuring them. But in this instance, our attention's directed to the passage itself. When water is heated, it's on the way from one state to another. Aristotle asked, what is operating here? Three things, he said. First, there's the common substrate, he said, the portion of water that undergoes the change and survives in the result. Second, there's an initial privation or lack, the water's absence of heat. And finally, there's a new actuation, the influx of heat into the water as it comes to a boil. This is all well enough, but the important point is this. The change itself is neither the water nor its cold state, nor the fire. The change itself is mere fluidity, a pure passage. Change is none of the above factors. It's their transformation. Some factors, such as the cold state, pass away. Others, such as the water itself, remain, more or less, throughout the entire process of being transformed. If we can accept the story so far, then we should accept the next point. Whatever is moved by another. With an eye to Aristotle, who would have nodded in agreement, Thomas continues.
But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality.
And Thomas gives us an example.
Thus, that which is actually hot, as fire, makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it.
Anything that changes must be acted upon by something else. Otherwise, we have a logical contradiction. For example, water cannot heat itself. If it could, it would have to be simultaneously and actually both hot and cold.
Now, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way a thing should be both mover and moved, that is, that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is moved must be moved by another.
Thomas's students might well have objected here that they'd all moved their own feet to get to his lecture. Indeed, Thomas himself distinguishes living from non-living things precisely on the ground that the living are able to move themselves. Plants move themselves by growth and nutrition. Higher animals move themselves by locomotion and perception. But Thomas thinks that a living thing moving itself does not contradict the principle that all things in motion are moved by yet another mover. Within a complex organism, Thomas distinguishes the moving center of animal life, the vital soul, from the members and organs which are moved by it. The animal as a whole does move itself in walking, but it moves itself by one part, the soul, moving other parts, the members and organs. In Thomas's view, we must then account for what moves the soul. Again, we might ask, why is such a fuss being made over what's so obvious to our common sense? But it's important for Thomas that we not simply rest the case upon ordinary sense observation. Analyzing motion in terms of actuality and potentiality is meant to probe more deeply into the nature of motion and to show what necessarily operates within it. This requires us to follow the analysis wherever it may lead us, even if it leads us beyond motion to God as unmoved mover. Still working with Aristotle's reasoning, Thomas advances the next step in his argument.
If that by which something is moved be itself moved, then this moved mover also must needs be moved by another, and that by another again.
In mapping out this sequence of movers, Thomas explores Aristotle's concept of motion as change from potentiality to actuality. Not all philosophers will agree with Aristotle and Thomas that change is best analyzed using the concepts of actuality and potentiality. But there's a second point that's even more controversial. In his imaginary conversation with Aristotle, Thomas says,
But this series of moved movers cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover, and therefore no motion, seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are moved by the first mover.
Then Thomas adds briefly,
As the staff moves only because it is moved by the hand.
That is so cryptic that it seems more like code than a helpful illustration, but it's clear to Thomas's students. In the Summa, Thomas tells us that he is addressing beginners in theology. We need to remember that these beginners have already completed their studies in philosophy. He can count on them to have enough background to decode his reference. Indeed, he's probably taken many of the students at the Dominican House of Studies through Aristotle's proofs in the physics and the metaphysics. But if we're to appreciate the force of Thomas's argument, we need to remind ourselves of what was already familiar to his students. This concerns whether it's possible or impossible to have an infinite series. Taken at face value, an infinite series of movers seems quite possible. We might wonder if Thomas would so confidently declare that an infinite series is impossible if he'd known that the universe in its present state is several billion years old and may have proceeded from an even older state or series of states. Well, it so happens that we do know how he'd reply. One of the controversial issues among the learned of his day was whether it could be proved that the universe began at some definite moment of time, or whether instead it had always existed. Teachers in the Faculty of Arts at Paris practically identified philosophy with Aristotle. They were convinced that he had demonstrated the world to be eternal. But some theologians insisted that the very thought of an eternal world was contradiction. In this dispute about an infinite series, Thomas disagrees with the philosophers, but he's even more put out by the overzealous and indiscriminate attacks of some theologians. In a rare departure from his usual serenity, he grumbles that these theologians who think that an eternal world is a contradiction talk as though wisdom begins with their hawk-like vision.
Another surprising thing is that the best philosophers of nature failed to discern this alleged contradiction. The same situation emerges if we carefully consider the position of those who held that the world has always existed. For in spite of this, they teach that it was made by God, and perceived no logical inconsistency in this doctrine. Therefore, these theologians, who do decry such alleged inconsistency, with their hawk-like vision, are the only rational beings, and wisdom was born with them.
Thomas earns no thanks from either group for his subtle position. As a Christian, he's willing to believe that time itself is created in the same act by which the eternal God continually creates the universe. Nevertheless, Thomas also holds there is no reason why God himself must precede his own creation in time. And so there's nothing inconceivable about the notion of an eternal universe. Philosophically speaking, the universe could be without a beginning. On the face of it, Thomas seems to contradict himself. He holds on the one hand that there cannot be an infinite series, and declares on the other hand that there can be such a series. But we're usually too hasty when we charge a trained mind with such an obvious contradiction. When Thomas insists that the series of movers cannot be infinite, he has in mind a second kind of series, a series quite different from a series that has no beginning. Still talking with Aristotle in the Summa Theologiae, Thomas draws a distinction between two senses of beginning. Then, on the basis of two beginnings, he distinguishes two kinds of series.
There are two kinds of causes. One kind is essential, the other accidental. An essential cause of something is that which directly causes it through the cause's own power, as water is the cause of cooling. But an accidental cause of something is that which causes it indirectly, for example, by removing an opposing cause, as when it cools a house by putting out a fire.
In one sense, to begin is to start. Here a beginning is part of the movement which follows. A beginning is that movement's initial moment. But in another sense, to begin is to originate. Such a beginning is not merely a starting point, but is rather the very source and origin of the whole movement. As we'll see, a beginning in time is distinguished from a beginning cause. Modern cosmology theorizes that there was a condensed cloud point at the very beginning of our present universe, a cloud point existing even before the supposed Big Bang. But we can still entertain the suspicion that there was a previous state, a state before the emergence of our current universe. And before that, is still another, and perhaps another, to infinity. But Thomas says that whether or not the time series has a start, there's a second kind of series, a series of causes or movers. This series makes its presence felt in time, but it's not itself essentially temporal. It's not successive or diachronic, but simultaneous or synchronic. We recognize something similar when we recognize that some necessary and sufficient conditions must exist to enable a particular event to occur. Modern holograms, three-dimensional images in which every part contains the features of the whole, reawaken our sense that many dynamic factors often coexist simultaneously in a complex whole. Ecological studies also remind us that natural events have complex and simultaneous causes. Nevertheless, our long-standing modern impulse is to break complex units down into the simplest elements and then arrange them in a time sequence. They seem only then to be more precise, more certain, neater. We're still prone today to speak of causation in terms of a temporal series of events. We tend to think of a cause as a preceding condition. Sequential causality has been aptly called two-event causation. Event A, say a billiard ball struck by a pool cue, occurs at time 1. Event B follows at time 2. The ball thuds against the table cushion. If we dare to say that A at time 1 causes B at time 2, we have seen two-event causation. But Thomas speaks about another series that may be called one-event causation. A modern Thomist explains the notion this way.
Causing and being caused are not, therefore, two events, one taking place in the agent and the other in the patient. They constitute a single ontological event. It follows necessarily, and obviously, that it is impossible for them to be anything else than simultaneous.
An event may take place in one instant or over a series of moments, but the relevant series of causes operates simultaneously. Joint causation is necessary, as with a conductor in a symphony orchestra. Thomas's second series of causes simultaneously originates some event or result. Thomas calls this second series, the series of essential causes or movers, a per se series. Others have called it a vertical series to distinguish it from the horizontal time series. Whereas a time series need not have a first event, the per se series must have a first cause. There must be a source of motion, or there would be no motion in the first place. A first and ultimate source must move the other movers without itself being moved by another. This is the unmoved mover. The conclusion draws itself.
Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover, moved by no other.
But then Thomas adds, with a flourish,
And this everyone understands to be God.
There is no denying that this flourish is also a leap. Thomas leaps from what looks very much like the unmoved mover to what looks very much like the biblical God. This is the conclusion of Thomas's first way of proving God's existence. Each of his remaining 4 ways of proving God's existence ends with the same flourish. So, in the first way, we've seen that the unmoved mover is God. In the second way, the uncaused cause is God. In Thomas's third way, the necessary being is God. And in the fourth way, the perfect goodness is God. Finally, in Thomas's fifth and most popular way, the guiding intelligence is God. A modern interpreter has said that Thomas frees God from the categories of motion, causality, necessity, goodness, and governance, since in themselves these names are too restrictive. This interpreter says that only the category of being can be broad enough for God.
How does this get God out of the categories? If such a being were in a category, that category would have to be the category of being. Now, no act of existing can be a category.
In moving beyond these categories, Thomas moves beyond his philosophical sources, but he remains in the line of philosophy. We need to think a bit more about what Thomas has proven, if indeed he's proven anything. At issue in these 5 ways is not how a specific quality gets transmitted from one thing to another. Rather, the issue is how that quality exists at all. Thomas clearly says in the Summa that the movement he speaks about is not simply a movement from one place to another, nor an increase in size or weight, nor a change of color or shape. He speaks of movement in the most fundamental terms, so all these specific movements are, at bottom, the primal movement of coming to be. So Thomas's first way doesn't concern the transmission of motion from one thing to another. Modern physics can tell us much more about that. Rather, the first way of proving God's existence addresses why motion exists at all. What is at stake is the very existence of motion. Of course, we can ignore or neglect the original cause of motion. Indeed, we mostly do ignore it in order to get on with the demands of everyday life. Someone who always wonders about the origin of things is usually dubbed by practical people to be a poet, maybe somewhat odd, or at least impractical. For Thomas, however, philosophy consists in consolidating that wonder, in entertaining it, in exploring it methodically, and in following wherever it leads. We can suppress the question that asks why the causes of motion exist, but if left alone, our questioning impulse leads us to seek an explanation for all indispensable aspects of the observed motion. To communicate the fact of existence is the prerogative of a being that does not come from others. This being exists by right. Such a being simply is. It is pure being. The absolute first being in the order of movers is itself ungenerated being. It does not come to be. The first mover communicates to others the being without which nothing at all would exist. In Thomas's words,
As long as the cause remains, the effect remains. If the cause is removed, the effect is removed too.
if this first mover didn't exist, there would be no movement. Since we began by observing that there is movement, then there must be such a being. The essential nature of an original cause is that it must be, through and through, pure, self-subsistent being. In the language of actuality and potentiality, the original cause is the pure actuality of existence. It needs no other being in order to exist, nor does it need to be explained or justified. On the contrary, the existence of everything else is explained and accounted for by the first cause. Thomas's four other ways of proving God's existence help us to see the richness of this pure being. Such a mover, itself unmoved, and such a cause, itself uncaused, is absolute and necessary being. It has all the attributes that belong to pure being. It is all that is good and highest, intelligent and purposeful. In a word, it is divine.
And it is this that everyone understands to be God.
Thomas has no doubt that human reason here catches a glimpse of the same God recorded in the Bible. Thomas believes God has revealed himself to Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike, and in his own way to all mankind. But words can only do so much. It's time to reflect on the proof and to bring it to the test of our own experience.
This is the end of tape number 1 on St. Thomas Aquinas. The presentation is continued on tape number 2.
Same God recorded in the Bible. Thomas believes
This is the end of tape number 1 on St. Thomas Aquinas. The presentation is continued on tape number 2. This is tape number 2 on St. Thomas Aquinas.
Thomas's proof for the existence of God contains within itself only a minimal indication of him. The proof is not much in comparison with the divine reality itself, but in Thomas's mind that little goes quite a long way. He tells us that even though we can know that God exists, we don't and can't know just what he is. The best we can do is cultivate the precious hints implied in the proof. But we must remember that all names, even positive ones, identify God only by setting him apart from creatures. Names said of God do not give us the kind of knowledge that we normally obtain about things. In an earlier work, Thomas had written,
The chief way to consider the divine essence is by way of negation. For by its immensity, the divine essence transcends every form attained by our intellect. And so, in apprehending it, we do not know what it is. But by knowing what it is not, we get some knowledge of it. And the more things we are able to deny of it, the nearer we come to knowing it.
In the Summa, Thomas speaks of this negation as knowledge by removal, or remotion.
Once we know that a thing exists, there remains the further question of the manner in which it exists. Now, because we cannot know what God is, but rather what he is not, we have no means for considering how God exists. It can be shown how God is not by removing from him whatever is not fitting, and these are composition, motion, and the like.
Thomas starts out to show that God is simple. He disputes the idea that he is complex in any way. We can see this by continuing to compare God to creatures. Every creature has potentiality or passivity in its makeup because that's the nature of any compound. Consider, if in forming a compound, two actual substances were to preserve their own identity, then they would remain two substances. No new single composite would result. Hydrogen would still be hydrogen and oxygen would be oxygen, but they could not combine to become H2O or water, which has very different properties. So every composition has passivity or potentiality in its makeup, whereas God does not. One part of a composite may be an active component, while the other is a more passive component. For example, heat may be the active element in water, and electric current can be active in a metal wire. But the separate components of a compound have the potential to combine into an actual new unity. As malt and water unite to form beer, each component surrenders the independence that it enjoyed in its pure state. Thomas examines many kinds of compositions and concludes that God is not made according to any of them.
The absolute simplicity of God may be shown in many ways, for there is neither composition of quantitative parts in God, since he is not a body, nor composition of form and matter, nor does his nature differ from his subsistence, nor his essence from his being. Neither is there in him composition of genus and difference, nor of subject and accident. Therefore it is clear that God is in no way composite, but is altogether simple.
God has no potential to change or combine. The unmoved mover, the uncaused cause, is pure actuality. Thomas remarks,
It has already been shown that there is some first being whom we call God, and that this first being must be pure act, without the admixture of any potentiality. God is infinite, comprehending in himself all the plenitude of the perfection of all being.
It's important to recognize that Thomas's conclusion is not a generalization arrived at by counting and inspecting every kind of combination. To make his point, he doesn't need to mention every possible composition. His argument holds for anything and everything that has any passivity or potentiality in it at all. Every creature has its own essence and its existence as a fundamental part of its composition. And every creature is contingent. That is, its existence depends on many other things. Thomas says a creature can be what it is only by receiving its existence and essence from the cause of being. Now, God is not made according to any mode of composition, not even any composition of essence and existence. In the first place, God's not made at all. God's very essence is to exist. He exists by his very nature. God is ultimately distinguished from all other creatures because God is being, but creatures only have being. And creatures have their being only as long as God communicates it to them. In a number of articles in the Summa Theologiae, similar arguments are advanced to show that this purely actual, simple God is perfect, good, infinite, omnipresent, changeless, eternal, and unique. In this long argumentation, Thomas begins to make explicit the deepest meaning of his key term, which translates as act or actuality. In doing so, he takes a step beyond his mentor Aristotle. Thomas tells us that the primary meaning of act is not form or substance. Act is the very act of being. Act is existence itself.
Being is what is most perfect in everything, because it is related to everything else as act. For nothing is actual except inasmuch as it exists. And so it is that being itself is the actuality of all things.
And again, he says,
The act of being is that which is most intimate in each and everything, and what is deepest in them all, since it is formal and decisive in relation to everything else that goes to make up a thing.
It's not surprising, then, that Thomas finds the most fitting name for God to be the very name that God has given himself, a name that human reason recognizes as the supreme name. Following the Latin understanding of a biblical text, Thomas renders the divine name revealed to Moses as He Who Is. In this scriptural expression, Thomas finds theological confirmation of what his philosophy also tells him. God is pure being, or pure act. God is the subsistent being itself. This is a high point for Thomas, since this active sense of being lights up all he has to say about God and creatures. Its importance is shown by the unusually personal way in which Thomas introduces this sense of being in his disputed question on the power of God. In arguing his own position in the Summa and elsewhere, Thomas invariably begins his response with the stock scholastic formula in the impersonal third person. In reply, it must be said. Very rarely does he speak in the first person. But something of the excitement of his insight shows through in the way he draws our attention to the ultimate principle on which everything else depends.
This act of being that I am talking about is the most perfect of all things. And this is obvious from the fact that act is always more perfect than potency. What I call the act of being is the actuality of all acts, and for this reason is the perfection of all perfections. Nothing can be added to the act of being that is extraneous to it, since nothing is extraneous to it except nothing.
This name, pure, subsistent act of being, distinguishes God from creatures in the most absolute way. At the same time, God's name is the most positive and actual of all names, and so Thomas also calls this name the name by way of excellence, or supereminence. This name enables us to speak further about God. Since God causes creatures to be, Thomas reasons that some remote likeness of their cause must reside in them. And so we can sort through the various names and the perfections they signify to find some few that will permit us to speak fittingly, though still inadequately, about God. We know already that we can only use names that signify qualities that can be infinitely expanded and elevated. Thus, for example, we can say that God is good and wise because we can't have too much goodness or wisdom. God possesses infinitely expandable qualities in a manner that transcends earthly realities. Yet Thomas says that God is not an impersonal being. Rather, he possesses a supreme intelligence and will, and that he is knowingly and lovingly concerned with his creatures. Thomas puts it,
God necessarily knows things other than himself, for it is manifest that he perfectly understands himself. Otherwise his being would not be perfect, since his being is his act of understanding. Now, if anything is perfectly known, it follows of necessity that its power is perfectly known. But the power of anything can be perfectly known only by knowing to what that power extends. Since, therefore, the divine power extends to other things by the very fact that it is the first effective cause of all things, God must necessarily know things other than himself.
what's more, God not only knows, he loves.
God loves all existing things. For all existing things, insofar as they exist, are good, since the being of a thing is itself a good, as is likewise whatever perfection it possesses. Now, God's will is the cause of all things. It must needs be, therefore, that a thing has some being and some kind of good, only inasmuch as it is willed by God. Hence, since to love anything is nothing else than to will good to that thing, it is manifest that God loves everything that exists, yet not as we love.
As the treatise on God unfolds still further, Thomas moves on into properly theological territory. He inquires into the Trinitarian nature of the divine life. This subject is not the business of the philosopher, yet the treatise bears reading because it thoughtfully reinterprets some accepted philosophical notions. The triune God, so to speak, bursts the ordinary meaning of unity because of the abundance of being and life that's contained within the Godhead. The mysterious and sacred fusion of unity and multiplicity in the one God is as much like a family of individuals as it's like one individual. Yet the triune God is utterly unlike both. In his analysis, Thomas stretches the boundaries of standard categories like unity and simplicity, sameness and difference, relation and personhood. The philosopher, in principle, can't follow Thomas the theologian into that realm of religious and spiritual revelation. He may not even want to. Nevertheless, the explosion of ordinary meanings caused by the revelation can give a philosopher pause. It can return him to more familiar paths with a new wariness about accepting the obvious. In the unity of the divine nature, the ordinary notion of relation as a connection between two or more things gives way to a transcendental notion that relations can be people charged with absolute independent reality. With considerable understatement, Thomas remarks,
A difficulty seems to arise from the fact that while the divine persons are multiplied, the essence nevertheless retains its unity.
Perhaps the most accurate meaning of Thomas's observation is that some theologians believe divine relations to be external connections between independent divine persons as they are in a way between human persons. Thomas continues,
In the relations, they thus considered only the idea of reference to another, and not the relations as realities in themselves. In creatures,
relations are accidental, whereas in God they are the divine essence itself.
As he turns to his treatise on creation, Thomas considers how creatures proceed from God. The causal relation between creatures and God is ever on his mind. He says that God's causation, looked at from the point of view of a creature, is the creature's participation. For as Thomas's proof of God intends to show, the creature receives its very being by participating in God's continuing presence. Knowingly or not, the creature exists in the presence of God. The participant, then, is not a moment in a time sequence or a link in a chain of causes. The participant is precisely a creature, a partner in a simultaneous vertical causation. In this unique communication, there's a continuing influx of being from the Creator, an influx that constitutes the whole and entire creature in its actual existence. And also, in this unique participation, a creature receives its own essence and its existence.
That God gives being to a creature depends on God's will, nor does he conserve things in being otherwise than by continually giving being to them.
Thomas asks whether the perfections of all things are in God. He replies that they are, but in a very different and higher way. The arguments against Thomas's position find their force in opposing attitudes about simplicity and complexity. Some objectors believe simplicity has an empty meaning, as with an empty cupboard that has no contents and is devoid of internal differences. These objectors set the simplicity of God against the multitude of determinations found in things.
It seems that the perfections of all things are not in God, for God is simple, whereas the perfections of things are many and diverse. Therefore, the perfections of all things are not in God.
Make up your mind, these objectors seem to say. God is either simple and therefore indeterminate, or he is filled with determinate content and therefore not simple. In a word, he's either simple or perfect, but not both. Another objector voices the difficulty literally.
Opposites cannot coexist. Now, the perfections of things are opposed to each other, for each species is perfected by its own specific difference. Therefore, because opposites cannot coexist in the same subject, it seems that the perfections of all things are not in God.
If a thing is green, then it's not some other color, and it can't be both simultaneously. Or again, if a thing is a lion, then it's not a lamb. And in general, if a being contained all perfections, it would be at war with itself. Therefore, to attempt to maintain simplicity and fullness in one and the same being is contradictory. The objector voices the ancient conundrum of the one and the many as it comes to a head in the divine nature. To resolve the impasse, Thomas compares the manner in which perfection exists in a cause and also in an effect. He says,
Whatever perfection exists in an effect must be found in the producing cause, either in the same way as when man reproduces man, or in a higher degree. Thus, the likeness of whatever is generated by the sun's power is in the sun. Now it is plain that the effect pre-exists in the power of the agent in a more perfect way. Since, therefore, God is the first producing cause of things, the perfections of all things must pre-exist in God in a higher way.
If a cause belongs to the same order as an effect, as do, for example, the human parent and the human child, then the specific perfection exists in both in the same basic way. In this example, both parent and child have the capacity for being human, though they will differ as individuals. Thomas calls this a univocal likeness. But what if a perfection communicates to a receiver across these lines of resemblance? For example, the sun causes many effects that don't resemble the fiery ball in the heavens. It surely causes plants to grow and enables people to see. If we can speak here of a likeness at all between the cause and its effects, the similarity is not within the same order. Thomas calls this an equivocal or analogous likeness. He frequently speaks of the likeness that holds between cause and effect.
In every agent, that is properly called power by which the agent acts. Now, Everything that produces something by its action produces something like itself.
If we're to understand this maxim, however, we must abandon any notion of a physical resemblance. The likeness spoken of is not necessarily proportional, as in a scale model. It doesn't resemble someone as a photograph does. It's not a formal likeness at all. It's a likeness of presence. Let's consider the opposite case. If we blot out the sun, in its absence the green leaves will pale. Growth will stop and decay will begin. There's no formal resemblance between sun and chlorophyll or between sun and increasing plant size, but there is a real relation of presence. In this example, the presence is the solar energy which transforms the plant and which itself is transformed in the plant. So too is existence received and transformed in the creature. The primary and ultimate presence, Thomas argues, is the act of being. God, as first cause, communicates to us this presence of being. This presence of being is not merely psychological presence. It's not an idea in a mind, nor a cosmological presence, that is, a presence of a thing in nature. The presence of being is an ontological presence. The actuality of being stands prior to all else in every being. Without it, there is total absence. The presence of being is communicated from God to us, from the cause to the effect. Such a presence already exists in God in a higher, more eminent and active manner. Now, Thomas asks, what is the precise way in which God may be said to contain the perfection of the things he creates? He replies that God is the supreme agent who makes things be. In this sense, then, all the perfection of things pre-exist in God in the most perfect way, not as they are in themselves, but as they are in God's power to give them being. In his treatise on creation, Thomas begins with this question-like proposition: whether it's necessary that every being be created by God. The proposition is followed by several objections. The first of them has relevance for us today. The objector throws out this challenge.
It would seem that it is not necessary that every being be created by God. For there is nothing to prevent a thing from being without that which does not belong to its essence, as someone can be human without being white. But the relation of the thing caused to its cause does not appear to be of the very essence of beings. For some beings can be understood without that relation. Therefore, they can exist without it, and hence it is possible that some beings should not be created by God.
The objection argues that in order to know about things, we don't need to know about God and his creative causality. All we need to know are the things themselves. This objection says that instead of opening knowledge up to an infinite and mysterious ocean of substance, we can keep knowledge within the formal boundaries of things and avoid their deeper ontological roots, if they do in fact have any. We've already seen this cast of mind, which in our day has taken the name of positivism. In reply, Thomas concedes that at a certain level we can know things on their own terms. He agrees we can arrive at suitable descriptions or definitions of all things, but this knowledge is incomplete, he says, since what a thing is involves the cause of its being just as much as it involves its definition and properties. So to completely know things, we must inquire into their deepest origin.
It must be said that everything that in any way is from God. For whatever is found in anything by participation must be caused in it by that to which it belongs essentially. God is self-subsisting being itself, and subsisting being can be only one. Therefore, all beings other than God are not their own being, but are beings by participation. What is greatest in being and greatest in truth is the cause of every being and of every truth.
Having concluded that every being must be caused by God, we may be surprised to find the next article asking whether primary matter is created by God. Surely Thomas has already answered this in the previous topic, but a little thinking shows that this is not so. Every created being is, for Thomas, a composite. But primary matter is pure and unformed. Primary matter is the potentiality to form, and so it's a simple component of certain kinds of composites. Primary matter is not itself a composite. Now, some philosophers have held that unformed matter has existed throughout eternity. It's the pure potentiality used by God in forming things. This is similar to the modern view that the world about us has emerged from a chaotic swirl of atomic matter that's existed forever. We've already seen Thomas's position regarding the eternity of the world, but what is strictly at issue is not whether the world is eternal, but whether there is anything that is uncreated other than God. Prime matter isn't much, it isn't actual, it's merely potential. Yet that's too much for Thomas. For him, absolutely nothing is independent of God's creative power. For his dialogue on creation, the objectors have other arrows in their quivers. One emphasizes the differences between gods and creatures. The objector puts the case.
It would seem that primary matter is not created by God. For whatever is made is composed of a subject and of something else. But primary matter has no subject. Therefore, primary matter cannot have been made by God.
Thomas concedes that when we consider the familiar changes around us, we think of an existing object that then undergoes change. Indeed, Aristotle had even described a pre-existing substrate that undergoes change. But when we speak of creation, we speak of a kind of coming into being that has no preceding state. Creation does not presuppose an existing subject waiting in the wings to receive being. Before a being is created, it's nothing at all. Indeed, it's not too much to say that before the world was created, whether from eternity or not, it was not possible for the world to be. A second objector still denies that matter is made by God, borrowing Thomas's own characterization of God as pure act.
Activity and passivity are opposite members of a division. But just as the first active principle is God, so the first passive principle is matter. Therefore, God and primary matter are two principles divided against each other, neither of which is derived from the other.
And so the objector protests that something does escape God's creative power and will. Here we come to the crucial issue. In his solution, Thomas takes us through a brief lesson in the history of philosophy. It's drawn mostly from Aristotle's metaphysics, but it goes beyond that great philosopher. As he looks back over the progress of philosophy, Thomas identifies three major stages in the philosopher's struggle to know the truth about things. What's at issue is the nature of being and what it means to come to be. In philosophy's first stage, which corresponds to the Greek philosophers before Plato and Aristotle, Thomas notes that the materialists were dominant.
At first, being rather undeveloped, they failed to realize that any beings existed other than sensible bodies.
Some early philosophers, like Parmenides, had denied that any being comes to be. Being is being, and that's that. Others, such as Heraclitus and Empedocles, had admitted that things come into being, but they'd pictured movement and becoming in purely physical terms. Following Aristotle, Thomas recapitulates the development of early thought.
The ancient philosophers gradually, and as it were, step by step, advanced in the knowledge of truth. At first, being rather undeveloped, they failed to realize that any beings existed except sensible bodies. And those among them who admitted movement did not consider it except according to certain accidents. For instance, according to rarefaction and condensation.
All of these early philosophers supposed the universe to be an uncreated material substance which takes on different shapes and qualities, and they believed that only physical forces altered that universe. A second stage of philosophical thinking was reached by Plato and Aristotle. Plato's theory of ideas or forms became the basis for the way things are. Each thing comes to be by participating in one or more forms. Being was no longer identified with what is material and sensible, but with various kinds of things. To the question, what is it for a thing to be? Plato and Aristotle answered, it's to be a certain kind of thing. It's to be an instance of one or another type. To come to know things, we need to classify them according to what they are. In Thomas's words,
an advance was made when Plato and Aristotle understood that there was a distinction between the substantial form which determines what the thing is, and matter, which constricts the form to an individual. They held matter to be uncreated, and they posited certain universal causes for the change in things.
These first two stages of philosophy prepared the way for the third. Looking back to the first two stages, Thomas finds that they've kept being under wraps. The way they considered being was too restricted. Philosophers in the first stage saw being as this or that state of affairs, hot or cold, large or small. Philosophers in the second stage saw being as this or that specific sort of thing, animal, vegetal, inorganic, and other such classifications.
Each of these opinions, therefore, considered being under some specific or particular aspect, namely, either as this thing of a certain sort, or as a thing in one condition or another. And so, too, they assigned particular causes to the production of things.
Thomas believes his own work is the third stage of philosophical development. He puts forward what is, in truth, his own position with the modest words, "Then others advanced further." Thomas develops certain suggestions that he finds in the work of some Arabic and Jewish philosophers, such as Avicenna and Moses Maimonides. Of course, he's certainly aware of the biblical texts on creation and of the early Christian notion that creation was ex nihilo, out of nothing. But he ratifies this insight with a proper philosophical expression.
Others advanced further and raised themselves to the consideration of being as being. And they assigned a cause to things, not only according as they are things of this or that kind, or things in this or that condition, but according as they are beings.
At last, coming to be has itself come to be. Or rather, being and coming to be have been recognized at this third stage of philosophy. The cause of becoming has been proportionate to the understanding of reality at each stage. In the third stage, Thomas recognizes being in its absolute character. It's no longer under material and formal wraps. He can now say why we come to be, not in terms of material conditions or formal archetypes, but in terms of being itself. He continues,
Therefore, whatever is the cause of things considered as beings must be the cause of things, not only according as they are made particular by accidental forms, nor according as they are made to be this or that sort of thing by substantial forms, but also according to all that belongs to their being, in any way whatever.
Since prime matter is a component of material things, it too must be created as part of the things themselves, and it must be created by the pure being who causes all being, and whose proper effect is the being of things. This view remains true if the world has always existed, and it remains true if, as the Christian faith holds, it has not. After describing his view of creation, Thomas passes on to what he calls the Treatise on Angels. This treatise earned him the nickname the Angelic Doctor. No one had ever written so extensively and so clearly about pure spirits and first creatures. The concept of angels is another matter beyond the boundaries of philosophy, so we pass it by. But we should note how densely populated the universe is, at least as Thomas sees it. Between man and God there are countless hierarchies of angelic beings giving glory to God. There are also the angels' dark counterparts, what the Bible calls principalities and powers which work against God's intention. In his work on creation, Thomas takes up certain theological questions regarding the work of the 6 biblical days of creation. After this short section comes his treatise on man, which was to have an important and enduring influence in philosophical history. Before we turn to the treatise on man, though, we should mention Thomas's notion of image. That's a distinctive relation that serves as the bridge between man and God. And this notion of image plays an important role in his thoughts on providence or divine government. Thomas examines the scriptural adage that human beings are made in the image of God. This confirms his philosophical reasoning because it follows from the philosophical conclusion that God is the cause of man. This idea also follows from the philosophical maxim that every cause produces a likeness in the effect. Even though we've learned that the likeness may be a very remote one, Thomas asks whether the image of God is in man. His answer qualifies the ordinary meaning of the word image.
It is clear that the notion of likeness is essential to the notion of image, and that an image adds something to likeness, namely that it is copied from something else. For an image is so called because it is produced as an imitation of something else. And so an egg, however much like and equal to another egg, is not called an image of the other egg because it is not copied from it. But equality does not belong to the essence of an image, as we see in a person's image reflected in a glass. Yet equality is of the essence of a perfect image. For in a perfect image nothing is wanting that is to be found in that of which it is a copy. Now, it is manifest that in man there is some likeness to God, copied from God as from an exemplar. Yet this likeness is not one of equality, for such an exemplar infinitely excels its copy. Therefore, there is in man a likeness of God, not indeed a perfect likeness, but imperfect. And Scripture signifies the same thing when it says that man was made to God's likeness. For the preposition to signifies a certain approach, as of something at a distance.
Thomas further refines this concept of image in the next article, noting 3 different ways that a thing can be like God.
Some things are like God, first and most commonly because they exist. Secondly, because they live. And thirdly, because they know or understand. These last, as Augustine says, approach so near to God in likeness that among all creatures nothing comes nearer to him.
In his prologue to the second part of the Summa, Thomas tells us that God's image in man consists in man's free will.
Each person has understanding, free will, and command of himself. Following upon what has been said about God, who is the exemplar or model, and what has been said about the created things which have come about through the free use of the divine power, it remains to consider God's image, that is to say, the human being, insofar as he is himself the source of his acts, having free will and power over his own actions.
We realize ourselves as persons, above all, through appropriate activity. As we work and live with the actuality that is God, we become more God-like. At the same time, we define and shape ourselves.
What is particular and individual is found in a special and more complete way in rational substances, for they have dominion over their own actions. They are not only acted upon, as are other substances, but they act out of themselves. Now, it is proper to individuals to act, and so, among the various substances, a special name is given to individuals who possess a rational nature, and this name is person.
As Thomas turns to the nature of man, the angelic doctor knows full well that a human being is not an angel. Still, he believes the human soul is not merely a visitor to this planet. On the contrary, the soul is intimately present everywhere in the body as its home. More precisely, Thomas believes the body is taken up into the soul. By Thomas's time, the 13th century, Christians had drawn inspiration for over 1,000 years from Plato's teaching about the human soul. In grasping the soul's spiritual character, Plato had seemed almost to make it a sort of visitor, residing for a time in the body. Like the philosopher who returns to the cave in Plato's famous metaphor, the soul enters the body to arrange things for the body's good. After this long tradition of Platonism, perhaps nothing disturbed 13th century Christians more than the new ideas spawned by Aristotle's rediscovered works. The most upsetting idea of all was the way Aristotle bound the human soul so closely to the body. This seemed to threaten the cherished Christian concept of the immortal, separate soul. Indeed, Aristotle's ambiguous views in this vital question of the soul had created controversy among his Latin followers. Some philosophers claimed that Aristotle had denied the possibility that the human soul is immortal, and they embraced this view. Others broke with this interpretation, preferring the more independent and freewheeling Platonic soul. Thomas clearly accepts the general lines of Aristotle's teaching on the human soul. He insists that the soul benefits from its relation with the body, since only in the body can the soul realize its proper function. Thomas is determined to defend the integrity of the individual human being, body and all. The Platonists exaggerated the spiritual element in man, whereas the Latin followers of some Arabic philosophers subordinated the individual to a collective intelligence. Thomas disagrees with both.
If anyone say that the intellectual soul is not the form of the body, he must explain how it is that this action of understanding is the action of this particular man. For each one is conscious that it is he himself who understands. It is one and the same man who is conscious both that he understands and that he senses. But one cannot sense without a body, and therefore the body must be some part of man.
Thomas says that only with soul and body can the human being fully exercise his natural powers of nutrition, sensation, and perception, imagination and memory, emotion and desire. Only in union with the body can the soul carry out in full measure the intellectual activities of knowing and willing. But this intimate involvement of soul and body was too much for many theologians and devout Christians, even though the Christian theology of the Incarnation and the resurrection emphasizes the importance of the body in human life. Thomas seems to some to veer towards a sort of materialism, a view that reduces the soul to a mere effect of the body. In this view, the soul perishes with the corruption of the body. But Thomas also may be seen as making his own way, taking a step beyond Aristotle without going back to Plato. To Thomas, neither the philosophers nor their opponents are right. The human soul is neither lost in matter nor indifferent to it. In most of its functions, the human soul exercises the primary informing role in the human composite, giving the composite its specifically human nature, but it has its own proper activity as well.
This is the end of Side 1. Please fast forward and turn over your cassette.
So for centuries, philosophers had questioned and pondered the nature of the soul. In an unusually elaborate argument, whose length shows the importance of the topic and the lively controversy that surrounded it, Thomas establishes that there is but one soul in man. The soul is the intellectual principle that distinguishes man from other animals. Through the soul, man lives and feels and has his being.
It must be said that the intellect, which is the principle of intellectual operation, is the form of the human body. For that whereby anything acts is, in the first place, a form of the thing to which the act belongs. Thus, that whereby a body is primarily healed is health, and that whereby the soul knows primarily is knowledge. Hence, health is a form of the body, and knowledge is a form of the soul.
As always, Thomas gives his reasons.
The reason for this is that nothing acts except so far as it is in act. And so, a thing acts by that whereby it is in act. Now, it is clear that that by which the body lives is, in the first place, the soul. And as life manifests itself through various operations in different degrees of living things, that whereby we primarily perform each of all these vital actions is the soul. For the soul is the primary principle of our nourishment, sensations, and local movement, and likewise of our understanding. Therefore, this principle by which primarily we understand, whether it be called the intellect or the intellectual soul, is the form of the body. This is the demonstration used by Aristotle.
So the intellectual soul is the first and specific form of the human body. Thomas now considers the soul in itself. The human soul has a power that it exercises alone. This is the activity of understanding. Not only does this distinguish man from other animals, but it's an activity that a bodily organ can't perform. The body must always be located in this or that particular situation and be restricted by this or that set of definite conditions, circumstances. The body's nutritive and sensory powers are also restricted to a definite time and place. We see only as far as the horizon and from our own limited point of view. But in understanding, the mind is not confined in these ways. Of course, the human individual, body and soul, is the one who knows things. But he knows by transcending in time, place, and matter. Thomas says further,
The human soul, by reason of its perfection, is not a form immersed in matter, or entirely embraced by matter. The soul is separate according to its intellectual power, because an intellectual power is not the power of a corporeal organ, as the power of seeing is the act of the eye. For understanding is an act which cannot be performed by a corporeal organ, as can the act of seeing. Nevertheless, the soul exists in matter, insofar as the soul itself, to which this intellectual power belongs, is the form of the body.
To sum up how Thomas sees it, the soul is a non-material form of the body, and this soul can act through its own resources independently of the body. Over 1,500 years before Thomas, Plato had described an idea as a kind of form. Now Thomas has described the soul as the non-material form of the body. He goes on to say that forms in nature are found in various steps or grades.
The nobler a form is, the more it dominates corporeal matter, the less it is immersed in matter, and the more it surpasses matter by its power and its operation. Hence we find that the form of a compound has an operation different from that caused by its elements. And the higher we advance in the nobility of forms, the more we find that the power of the form surpasses the elementary matter, as the vegetative soul excels the mineral form, and the sensitive soul excels the vegetative soul. Now, the human soul is the highest and noblest of forms, and so, in its power, it surpasses corporeal matter, by the fact that it has an operation and a power in which corporeal matter has no share whatever. This power is called the intellect.
The ladder of forms leads up from inorganic forms through the various kinds of souls and even beyond the intellectual soul. Each step moves away from the conditions of matter and more towards the freedom of spiritual being. We've seen that Thomas believes the essential nature of knowledge is to transcend the conditions of matter. Light, more light, the Greek hero is supposed to have cried, and Thomas takes up the cry. In an earlier part of the Summa, he asks whether there is knowledge in God. His answer tells us a good deal about what he takes to be the root character of knowledge.
Knowing beings are distinguished from non-knowing beings, in that the non-knowing possess only their own form, whereas the knowing being is naturally disposed to possess also the forms of other things. For the species or likeness of the thing known is in the knower. Hence it is manifest that the nature of a non-knowing being is more contracted and limited, whereas the nature of knowing beings has a greater amplitude and extension. That is why the philosopher says that the soul is, in a sense, all things. Now, the contraction of a form comes through the matter. Hence, according as they are the more immaterial, forms approach more nearly to a kind of infinity. Therefore, it is clear that the immateriality of a thing is the reason why it is cognitive, and the manner of cognition is proportioned to the mode of immateriality. Hence, it is said in Aristotle's book On the Soul that plants do not know because of their materiality, but sense is cognitive because it can receive species or images free from matter.
Thomas now reaches his point.
The human intellect is still further cognitive because it is still more separated from matter and unmixed.
In brief, immateriality is the currency of knowledge, intelligence is its broker, and intelligible meanings are its coin. Turning back to the question, Thomas draws a conclusion about whether knowledge is in God.
Since, therefore, God is in the highest degree immaterial,
It follows that he possesses the highest kind of knowledge.
Intellectual knowledge, then, is a sign of the spirituality that energizes the human center. But for Thomas, the human being is the lowliest of spiritual beings, a sort of suburban dweller among the community of spiritual beings, a rustic living on the border of time and eternity. The levels of physical reality in man are joined with the spiritual soul to form the unique human composite of matter and spirit.
Man, in a certain sense, contains all things. Now, we may consider four things in man: his reason, which makes him like to the angels; his sensitive powers, whereby he is like the animals; his natural powers, which liken him to the plants; and the body itself, wherein he is like to inanimate things.
Man's very complexity, however, removes him from the full actuality of spirit. For Thomas, human knowledge is relatively empty, but he doesn't agree with Plato that the soul knows things by remembering them from before birth. Thomas says the soul must learn from its situation in the human body. Nothing is known naturally unless it's drawn from experience. We must continually learn by looking, listening, feeling, remembering. This is what Thomas means when he says that the soul is in the body for the good of the soul, and therefore for the good of the whole person.
If Plato were right, then the union of the soul and body would not be for the soul's good. It is clear that it was for the soul's good that it was united to a body, and that it understands by turning to the phantasms. Nevertheless, it is possible for it to exist apart from the body, and also to understand in another way.
Thomas proves, to his satisfaction, that the soul survives death and the corruption of the body. Still, after death, the separated soul loses its ordinary powers, so that divine grace alone can come to the rescue. Indeed, Thomas's theology brightens the fate of the soul separated from its body, since it promises to fully restore the soul and body in the resurrected and transformed human being. Philosophy, on the other hand, has little to say about the state of the separated soul. Still, Thomas's philosophy does have something to say about the soul after death. He affirms that the soul survives, but his philosophy says little about what its condition is. By its nature, the soul has many powers. These include the vegetal powers of nutrition, growth, and excitation, and the animal powers of sensation, perception, memory, and imagination. But the soul exercises these powers by means of the body. Lacking bodily organs, they withdraw after death into a latent state within the soul. Thomas's philosophy also says the soul possesses the rational powers of understanding and choice. He takes as his principle the following maxim: operation follows upon being. In other words, the kind of activity that anything performs will tell you what manner of being it is. It follows, then, that if the soul can here and now transcend the bodily situation, then it exists right now, with an active being that transcends the fate of the body. With this reasoning, Thomas arrives at his distinctive solution. The soul is not only the form of the human body, it is also a substance, something in its own right. But he adds, it's an incomplete substance. To be sure, Thomas says the soul continues to exist even after separation from the body because it is immaterial. The soul's immaterial because it can perform an action that transcends its material being. But the soul's natural state is to be united with the human body as its form. Apart from that union, the soul is incomplete. Thomas's solution satisfied neither side of the debate about the soul. Not the Platonists, who thought that the human soul is a complete substance without any essential connection with the body. Surely not the materialists, who thought the individual soul is merely an effluence of the body, without any independence from it. Among the materialists were philosophers who based their view on their understanding of certain Arabic thinkers. They argued that the individual human being was wholly material and mortal. When it was pointed out to the materialists that individual human beings transcend the mortality of their bodies whenever they arrive at objective knowledge, they replied that such knowledge does not belong to the individual at all. Rather, it belongs to a kind of common mind in which individuals share whenever they gain true knowledge. The materialists posited a sort of common intelligence of the race, separated from individuals. Against the materialists, Thomas defends the integrity of each individual knower. He argues that an individual's knowing and choosing are his alone. Knowing and choosing reside in the ambient core of truly spiritual being, and that domain is also the home of individual freedom.
We are masters of our own actions by reason of our being able to choose this or that. Man is said to be made to God's image, insofar as he is an intelligent being endowed with free choice and self-movement, and is the principle of his actions, having free choice and control of his actions.
Thomas devotes the longest, and many say the most original section of his Summa to the question of human freedom and its outcome. The first half of this section is devoted to human destiny, to the actions that lead toward fulfillment or away from it. For Thomas, the meaning of an action stems primarily from the objective which calls it forth. The technical name for such an objective is the end of the action, or its finality. Commenting on Aristotle, Thomas puts it this way.
If we inquire what is the good intended in any act or any enterprise, it should be known that the good is that for whose sake all else is done. For in medicine all is done for the sake of health, in the military art all for the sake of victory, and in building all for the sake of making a house. Also, in any business at all, there is an intended good for whose sake all is done. Now, this intended good in each and every work or act of choice is called the end, for the end is simply that for the sake of which all else is done.
Thomas frequently employs the maxim, every agent acts for an end. The end prompts the agent, calling, but not compelling, the action into being. Thomas asks whether human life has an ultimate end or finality, and what that end might be. Taking his stand with Aristotle, Thomas argues that the ultimate end of human life is happiness, though not everything that promises to contribute to happiness really does so.
If we immediately discover an end to which all that is done in the human arts and works is directed, then such an end will be the good that is worked for, absolutely. That is, it will be what is intended, at least indirectly, in all human works. But if in this matter several goods are discovered, reason must transcend this plurality until it comes to the thing itself, that is, some one thing. For man's ultimate end as man must be one, by reason of the unity of human nature, just as there is one end for the medical doctor as a medical doctor because of the unity of the medical art. And this ultimate end of man as such, and not only as doctor or soldier or builder, is called the human good, which is happiness.
Now, concerning perfect happiness, Thomas finds the ultimate end of human life to be friendship with God. We pursue felicity in this life, but what alone will satisfy us completely is that face-to-face vision of God in which we share our life with God and God shares his with us. The uncertain happiness we find in this life, Thomas calls felicity. The ultimate happiness we attain in a face-to-face encounter with God, he calls beatitude. Having defined the distinctive nature of man and his capacity for thought and freedom, Thomas clarifies the proper meaning of a human act. He says that all actions are not acts. Some we do without thinking. A man scratches his beard without thinking. A woman fusses with her hair. We all digest our food and breathe normally without thinking about it. These are all actions of human beings. But what Thomas calls human acts require some degree of thought, deliberation, and choice.
Among man's acts, only those proper to man as man are properly called human actions. For it is as master of his own actions that man differs from other non-rational creatures.
Non-rational creatures, such as insects, fish, birds, and animals, are moved by instincts, by species-inherent drives and similar forces. People also have these specific drives for food, pleasure, and survival. They're given to us in our animality, but we're called to complete or perfect our humanity as responsible individuals.
So only those actions of which man is master are properly called human. Now, man is the master of his acts, through his reason and will, and consequently free choice is spoken of as the power of will and reason. Hence, acts properly called human are those that proceed from a deliberate act of will. Other actions belonging to man can certainly be spoken of as actions of man, but not properly as human actions, because they do not belong to man as man.
As the Summa Theologiae proceeds, Thomas begins a detailed examination of our passions or emotions, our habits, our virtues and vices. We share the passions with other animals as we respond to the challenges and attractions of our natural and social situation. We love or hate, we're attracted or repelled, we take delight or sorrow in our relationships. The enticements and frustrations of the good and evil in our situation move us to hope or despair, to audacious or timorous response, maybe even to anger. These emotions in themselves are neither good nor bad. They become so only in their concrete setting of freely chosen human actions. Nevertheless, the repeated experience of certain passions, coupled with repeated choices and actions, dispose a human agent to certain patterns of behavior. His conduct is directed along the lines of more or less stable actions. This stability is founded upon habits, such as a disposition to generosity or a tendency to lie. Because habits, as distinct from immediate feelings and emotions, are the product of repeatedly willed actions, we do speak of them as good or bad.
Sensory powers can be considered in two ways. First, insofar as they act from natural impulse, and second, insofar as they act under reason's rule. Insofar as they act by natural impulse, they are ordered and determined, just as nature is, to one thing or outcome. But insofar as they act under reason's rule, they can be ordered to various things. In this way, sense powers can have habits, by which they are well or badly disposed towards something.
Today we usually restrict the term virtue to moral actions, but the word is broader for Thomas. A virtue is any disposition towards authentic human good, a sort of habit of doing good. Vices are habitual dispositions that tend away from good. According to Thomas, a morally virtuous man is one who acts as he ought to act with regard to God, to other people, things, and himself. A moral virtue is a habit of the mind by which we live righteously. The web of lesser specific virtues hangs upon the chief or cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. Thomas distinguishes the cardinal virtues according to the faculty within us that each is meant to strengthen and guide.
There are four subjects of the virtue of which we now speak, namely, the power which is rational in its essence, and this is perfected by prudence, and that which is rational by participation, and is threefold: the will, the subject of justice; the power of desire, the subject of temperance; and the power of resistance, the subject of fortitude.
The life of grace depends on the theological virtues, the gifts of faith, hope, and charity.
In relation to both intellect and will, man needs to receive, in addition to the natural virtues, something supernatural, to direct him to a supernatural end. First, as regards the intellect, man receives certain supernatural principles, which are held by means of a divine light, and these are the things which are to be believed, and this virtue is faith. Secondly, the will is directed to this end, both as to the movement of intention, which tends to that end as something attainable, this pertains to hope, and as to a certain spiritual union, whereby the will is, in a way, transformed into that end, and this belongs to charity or love.
Thomas also discusses the counterparts of virtue, the vices, which include uncaring ignorance, sloth, negligence, injustice, and malice.
Three things are found to be contrary to virtue. One of these is sin, which is opposed to virtue in respect of that to which virtue is directed, namely the good. For, properly speaking, sin denotes a disordered act, even as an act of virtue is an ordered and fitting act. While in respect of that which belongs to the essence of virtue directly, its contrary is vice, because the vice of a thing seems to consist in its not being disposed in a way fitting its nature.
Throughout the Summa, Thomas speaks of man and God, but the communal nature of his thought is evident all along. Human society is situated within the community of beings, but whereas nature is a domain of more or less determined laws, the free character of human association calls for its own kind of law and government.
Man is by nature a social animal. Now, a social life cannot exist among a number of people unless someone presides who is to look after the common good. For many, as such, seek many things, whereas one attends only to one. That is why Aristotle says that wherever many things are directed to one end, we shall always find someone at the head directing them.
Near the beginning of his treatise on law, Thomas asks whether law is an affair of reason. In answering, he formulates a famous definition.
Law is nothing other than a reasonable directive, directing beings toward the common good, promulgated by the one who has the care of the community.
In discussing God's providence in the first part of the Summa, Thomas made a related point.
The whole community of the universe is governed by the divine reason. Therefore, the very notion of the government of things in God, the ruler of the universe, has the nature of a law. And since the divine reason's conception of things is not subject to time, but is eternal, therefore this kind of law must be called eternal.
He then develops three subordinate kinds of law from the eternal law. There's natural law, which is inherent in the kind of beings humans are. There's human law, which is what we normally mean by the kind of positive law that legislatures pass and courts pass upon. And there's divine law, the revealed law, the old law of the Old Testament and the new law of the Gospel. Natural law tends to remain general and implicit. Human and divine laws are intended to provide more detailed guidance and complete the fabric of social directives. Thomas also puts the question whether there is in us a natural law. He gets his answer from eternal law, based on the idea that human reason participates in God's providence.
Now, among all others, the rational creature is subject to divine providence in a more excellent way, insofar as it itself partakes of a share of providence, by being provident both for itself and for others. Therefore it has a share of the eternal reason, whereby it has a natural inclination to its appropriate activity and end. And this partaking of the eternal law in the rational creature is called natural law.
Thomas knows that different peoples have different customs, but he also upholds the notion that human nature is commonly shared and that human needs are everywhere similar. So the philosopher's task, then, is to identify and describe the fundamental ways in which we do good and avoid evil. Thomas believes we are called to follow God's intention that we do good and avoid evil. These basic directives, written into the very heart of man, are the primary precepts of natural law. Thomas says that in natural law there's first a general directive to preserve ourselves. This command holds for groups as well as for individuals.
The order of the precepts of the natural law is the same as the order of our natural inclinations. For there is in man a primary and natural inclination to good, which he has in common with all things, inasmuch as everything desires the preservation of its own being according to its nature.
Thomas continues,
There is in man a second inclination to more specific ends, according to the nature he has in common with other animals. According to this inclination, those things are said to belong to natural law, which nature has taught all animals. Instincts such as the joining of husband and wife, the education of children, and so forth.
The human character of Thomas's examples may surprise us, but it reminds us that even our animal tendencies are part of our human nature. They fall under the law of human nature. Of course, there's also the natural human tendency to follow the dictates of reason.
Third, there is in man an inclination to good, according to the nature of his reason, and this is proper to man alone. Thus, man has a natural inclination to know the truth about God, and to live in society. And in this regard, whatever belongs to this inclination comes under the natural law, as, for example, to shun ignorance, and to avoid offending those with whom one has to live, and other similar things associated with such an inclination.
From these primary precepts of natural law, other more definite directives can be formulated. Many of them are embodied in proverbs, sayings, and maxims, but humans also need particular rules to guide them towards the good of the common life. This is the domain of positive human law. While recognizing the benefits of human law, Thomas also recognizes its limitations. As to whether human laws ought to prohibit all vices, he says,
"The human law ought not to prohibit all those vices from which the virtuous abstain, but only the more serious ones from which the majority may be expected to abstain, and above all, those which are harmful to others, and which threaten the continued existence of society itself, such as murder, theft, and the like."
But Thomas cautions that the governing power is not the private preserve of anyone.
Law, properly speaking, has as its first and foremost purpose the ordering of the common good. Now, to order anything to the common good belongs either to the whole people or to someone who is delegated to act on their behalf. Hence, the making of a law belongs either to the whole people or to a public personage who has responsibility for the whole people.
How should political and legal power be structured? Thomas favors a mixed polity of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy.
Everyone should have some part in the sovereignty. In this way, the peace of the people is preserved, and everyone loves and protects such an arrangement. Hence, the best system of government is found in a state or kingdom in which one person is placed in authority to preside over all in accord with virtue. Then under him are others ruling in accord with virtue. Yet such a government belongs to all, both because they can be elected out of all, and because they are also elected by all. Indeed, such is the best government, well formed by a mixture of kingship, in the sense that one person presides, and aristocracy, in the sense that many rule virtuously, and democracy, in the sense that leaders can be elected from among the populace, and further, that the choice of the leadership belongs to the people.
Here Thomas rationally justifies the structure of legitimate authority, and he also describes how we should seek the good of the whole community. For example, sedition stirs up division and rebellion, and Thomas agrees it's a grave evil. But if there's a tyranny, he says that rebellion is not seditious.
The rule of a tyrant is unjust, because it is directed not to the common good, but to the private good of the ruler. Therefore, the overthrow of this kind of government does not have the character of sedition, unless perhaps it produces such disorder that the society under the tyrant suffers greater harm from the resulting disturbance than from the tyrant's rule. Rather, it is the tyrant who is guilty of sedition, because he spreads discord and division among the people under him, so as to control them more securely. It is characteristic of a tyranny that it is directed to the personal interest of the ruler and to the harm of the community.
Interestingly, Thomas's concern for the common good is nowhere clearer than in his defense of private property. He finds that taking a moderate profit is reasonable, and he explains why it's best that individuals acquire, own, control, and dispose of private property. But then he turns from the right to possess property to discussing the question of use. Here he differs.
Each man should not hold external things for his own use, but for the good of the community, so that each one should readily share things with others in need.
And further,
what belongs to human law cannot cancel what is required either by natural law or by divine law. Now, according to the natural order founded by divine providence, material things are ordered to the alleviation of human needs. Therefore, the division and ownership of things ordained by human law must not interfere with the alleviation of human needs by means of those things. And so, whatever a man has in superabundance is owed of natural right to the poor for their sustenance.
Thomas places the primary obligation on the judgment of the individual who has resources, but he says that an endangered person might take what he needs without committing fraud or robbery.
If, however, there is such urgent and obvious need that there is clearly an immediate emergency for sustenance, as when any person is immediately endangered and without means of alleviation, then he may legitimately take from another person's goods what he needs, either openly or secretly. Nor is this, strictly speaking, fraud or robbery.
In particular social issues, Thomas, like every great thinker, is in part bound by his times and in part not. Many of his views on how Christian believers should relate to unbelievers and heretics were accepted in their time. They're simply unacceptable today. For example, he was concerned with regulating the dress of the Jews, but he opposed those who would force Jews to convert to Christianity.
The practice of the Church never held that the children of Jews should be baptized against the will of their parents. Therefore, it seems dangerous to bring forward this new view that, contrary to the previously established custom of the Church, the children of Jews should be baptized against the will of their parents.
Thomas says that religious conversion cannot be forced because faith cannot be forced. Here he includes Gentiles, mostly Muslims, in his argument.
Unbelievers, such as the Gentiles and the Hebrews who have never accepted the Christian faith, should in no way be forced to believe, for faith is a matter of the free will.
Thomas accepts slavery and serfdom, but limits the obedience enjoined by these institutions.
The inferior is not obliged to obey his superior when the latter commands something in matters where he is without authority, for all men are equal by nature. Hence, in the contracting of matrimony or making a vow of chastity or such things, servants are not obliged to obey their masters, nor children their parents. But in what has to do with the appropriate disposition of human actions and dealings, a subject is obliged to obey his superiors in the sectors of their superiority or authority, just as a soldier obeys his general in matters of war, a servant his master in the tasks assigned him, a son his father in matters included in the discipline and management of family life, and matters of this sort.
Thomas's views regarding women also are limited by the social conditions of his own time. Yet here, too, he seeks a reasonable basis for the relation between the sexes. Women were totally dependent in the society he knew, yet Thomas remarks in another work that husbands have obligations, too.
If a husband were permitted to abandon his wife, the society of husband and wife would not be an association of equals, but instead a sort of slavery on the part of the wife.
But Thomas says marriage is an association of equals for the following reason.
The image of God is common to both sexes, since it resides in the mind, where there is no distinction of sexes.
In the unfinished third part of Thomas's Summa Theologiae, as well as in the second half of the second part, the topics and arguments become more directly theological. Church fathers, church councils, papal writings, and canon law become more prominent. Aristotle is never forgotten, but St. Augustine and other religious writers come to Thomas's assistance as he thinks his way through Christ to the divine Trinity as the end and source of human life. The Summa traces out the great circle by which all of creation proceeds from God and returns to him, from eternity, through time, to eternity again. Thomas's own thought is caught up in that circle. He observes,
Through will and love, a person is somehow drawn into the very things willed and loved.
One of the most original modern interpreters of St. Thomas, Etienne Gilson, describes Thomas's lifelong search to understand, and in his understanding, to love.
It is not necessarily in the silence of a cell, nor in the turmoil of a university chair. It is not even necessarily under the vault of a church. It can also be on the road to Naples that the presence of Thomas can be felt. For myself, I never discover him anywhere so well as on the extreme point of one of those Italian promontories, those sun-beaten rocks whose every crack sustains fresh and green vegetation, and which St. Thomas Aquinas more than once beheld from the shore of the Tyrrhenian Sea. The time is noon. The brilliant sun of a May day sets everything in clear and sharp relief, like the definition of an exacting intellect. Near at hand, everything lies revealed in the clear evidence of its essence and enjoys the peace of its order. Farther off, the glance of the eye moves toward distances so brilliant that they are lost in their own expanse and disappear in the very excess of the light that covers them. What is more beautiful than this earth on which the source of distinctions is the very same as that of unity? Suspended between the heavens and the sea, some birds look down upon it from on high and glide like angels, until one of them, moving off with a great sweep of wings, answers the call of the sun, mounts, and, cutting the blue with his flight and his cry, rises to meet the light.
During the last weeks of his life, Thomas gave up writing the Summa. His secretary and companion, Reginald, was especially insistent one day that the master complete his greatest undertaking. To his dismay, Thomas answered,
Reginald, I am unable to do it.
Pressed further, Thomas refused again.
Reginald, I can't, because all that I have written seems like chaff to me.
Reginald was still insistent. A generally reliable biographer, one of Thomas's intimate associates, tells us that he reluctantly gave his reason.
All that I have written seems like chaff to me in comparison with the things that I have seen and that have been shown to me.
Thomas had come to the end of this life, but not without hope, for he'd written,
What is unknown cannot be loved, but it does not follow that knowledge is the same as love, since love is the goal of knowledge. And so love takes up where knowledge leaves off.
We hope you have enjoyed this presentation of St. Thomas Aquinas by Knowledge Products. The script for this presentation is by Kenneth L. Schmitz, Professor of Philosophy Emeritus and Fellow of Trinity College, University of Toronto. The script is edited by Professor John Locks of Vanderbilt University and Mike Hassel of Knowledge Products. Produced by Pat Childs. Vocal characterizations are by
Dan Church, Rob Daniel, Travis Hardison, Cecil Jones, Joe Keenan, John Sherberg, and Robert Wynn.
Music is by Ralph Childs. Recorded at Fred Jones Recording Services and Archer Productions. This material may not be copied in whole or in part without the written permission of the copyright owner. Copyright 1990 by Carmichael & Carmichael Incorporated. This presentation of the Giants of Philosophy is a part of the Audio Classics series, a continuing series of cassettes presenting the major ideas of great thinkers with the discussion of their historical and intellectual context.